American Indian movement was founded in 1968 in Minnesota by Dennis Banks, George Mitchell, Clyde Bellecourt, and many others. The goal of AIM was to better protect and care for Native American people, as well as lending a hand to Native Americans who have been displaced and treated unfairly by the government. Since its foundation, the group has led numerous protests, employment programs, and founded reservation communities.
In the early morning hours of November 20th, 1969, 79 American Indians, including students, married couples, and 6 children, set out to occupy Alcatraz Island. Alcatraz had been dormant for 6 years since the Bureau of Prisons closed the penitentiary. No one had come forward with the feasible plan for using Alcatraz, so American Indian activists decided to seize the island shortly before Thanksgiving and claim it as Indian land. This internationally publicized political protest was done to focus attention on the plight of American Indians. Indian unity was a key focus of the Indian movement, and there were plans to establish an American Indian cultural center on Alcatraz. For 18 months, American Indians and their families lived on the island. However, public interest in the occupation waned and order among those living on the island began to deteriorate. By late May, the government had cut off all electrical power and telephone service to the island. In June, a fire of disputed origin destroyed numerous buildings on the island. Left without power, fresh water, and in the face of diminishing public support and sympathy, the number of occupiers began to dwindle. On June 11, 1971, a large force of government officers removed the remaining 70 people from the island.
Through the 19th century, hundreds of thousands of Native Americans occupied land between the Mississippi and the Rocky Mountains. In April of 1868, the Treaty of Fort Laramie granted the Sioux Nation ownership of the Black Hills. This land was considered sacred to Native Americans as well as being great hunting land. However, once the government found gold in the Black Hills, they took back the treaty and forced the Native Americans to give back the land. This led up to the Great Sioux War of 1876. After much devastation and multiple casualties, in 1927, a white man dynamited and drilled the faces of 4 presidents into the side of the mountain. This aggravated the Native Americans because the monument celebrates European settlers who killed so many Native Americans and destroyed part of their sacred land. In response to this, a monument was drilled for the Sioux Nation onto the other side of Mount Rushmore, much larger than the faces of the president.
In the fall of 1972, hundreds of Native American activists and members of AIM set off on a cross-country journey. Several groups started in the West Coast, picking up others along their way. With them was a 20-point paper they had prepared to present to the government when they arrived to their destination in Washington, D.C. The goal of this protest was to raise media awareness to American Indian issues such as treaty rights, living standards, and inadequate housing. Upon arriving to Washington, D.C., the Nixon administration refused to meet up with the activists. Native Americans seized the Bureau of Indian Affairs office for 6 days. Later, the White House finally agreed to listen to them. Before leaving, they expressed their frustration by vandalizing the building's interior and confiscating BIA documents. The petition for treaty reform was denied.
3 weeks prior to the fateful Wounded Knee incident in the town of Custer, South Dakota, an Indian man was killed by a white man. The white man was charged with manslaughter and AIM intervened. When barred from entering the courtroom for the trial, they wreaked havoc on the town. Rioters burned the Chamber of Commerce building, sacked police cars, and vandalized the county courthouse. Nevertheless, the man was acquitted of the manslaughter charge. The people on the Pine Ridge Reservation were also being treated unjustly. Dick Wilson, a corrupt elected tribal chairman of the reservation, had been ruling the native people with an iron fist. He controlled the whole reservation, using goon squads to beat up Lakota that wouldn't conform. Impeachment hearings were held, but Wilson used techniques of intimidation and fear to retain his position. The Sioux had tried peaceful methods of achieving their goals, but peace hadn't brought them results. That was when AIM was called in. A plan was hatched to draw national attention to the problems that the Sioux had faced. The activists blocked off the small town in the Pine Ridge Reservation and held the government off with guns. The protesters wanted fair investigation of the corruption on reservations and broken treaties. On the second day, AIM was surrounded by armored personnel carriers, fighter jets were flying overhead, and the FBI wanted to solve the problem of the hostages being held by the Indians. The hostages refused to leave, blaming the government for not listening to the Native Americans, and also in protection of AIM, because they feared the government would open fire and kill everyone if they had the chance. Negotiators rejected the Sioux's request to uphold treaties and insisted they had no power to remove Dick Wilson.
During the day, life inside Wounded Knee was relatively calm, but at night it turned into a war zone. Shots were fired, and Vietnam War veterans said that the battlefield of Wounded Knee felt like the Vietnam War zone. Wilson's goon squad made matters worse by going in and shooting in both directions, hoping to provoke gunfire because they were angry the U.S. government hadn't taken Wounded Knee back. Massive media coverage was AIM's goal, to bring national attention to the movement, and also to prevent another massacre on the historic site. Polls taken reported that nearly 90% of Americans watched the nightly coverage of the siege. The government offered an ultimatum: the Indians leave on a certain day or they would come in by force. 2 days later, they withdrew the demand and changed tactics by removing all roadblocks and hoping the rebellion would resolve itself and disperse. That backfired, and more protesters and supplies poured into Wounded Knee. And then, the president of the Oglala, Russell Means, declared Wounded Knee an independent country and warned if any U.S. spies were found within their borders, they would be shot by a firing squad. The Sioux then took the case to the UN, but they refused to recognize the independent nation. A new negotiator arrived, and he cut the water and electricity lines and prevented food and ammunition from reaching the protesters. He also ordered reporters out of the city. Popular support was with the Native Americans, in part because the Godfather actor Marlon Brando refused his Oscar because of the portrayal of American Indians in the Hollywood film industry. The U.S. government knew it was over, and representatives from both sides signed a formal agreement. The conflict moved to the White House, where the U.S. government refused to negotiate before weapons were relinquished, and Native Americans refused to lay down weapons before negotiations began. Russell Means was then arrested. Conditions became worse as winter came. People were falling ill, and food was running short. On day 50, activist and pilot Bill Zimmerman flew over Wounded Knee and made a 2,000-pound food drop. As the hungry people gathered around the food, the U.S. opened fire on them. The first casualty, Frank Clearwater, was killed by a bullet to the head, which was shot through the plaster of the building he was taking refuge in. Then, on day 60, Oglala tribe member Buddy Lamont was shot and killed. The government agreed to cease fire so Lamont's family could bury him properly. He was laid to rest next to the victims of the first Wounded Knee massacre. Against AIM's opinion, the leaders of the Oglala tribe called for an end to the occupation. On May 8, 1971, the siege was over. AIM leaders agreed to lay down their weapons and to arrest, but many Indians fled Wounded Knee. The battle wasn't over, though. Dick Wilson's reign of terror followed, while the federal government looked the other way. In just 3 years, 2 FBI agents and 60 AIM supporters were murdered, resulting in Pine Ridge acquiring the highest per capita murder rate in the country. The government also persecuted AIM in court. 500 indictments were brought against AIM and their supporters, with only 15 resulting in conviction. While not the victory they were hoping for, the dedicated siege brought light to national light and the treatment of the Sioux tribe. It also inspired Native activism around the country. The culture was preserved by opening of Native schools and cultural centers.